In the third cycle of the Quiet Accord, the flagship of the Compact Admiralty received a signal. It was not a hail. It was not a demand for parley. It was not in any sense the Vosk recognize a lawful transmission at all. It was a single image, broadcast on every open band at once, holding for exactly 9 seconds before it went dark. A square of crimson. No glyph, no seal, no attestation mark, no sender identity, no closing sign. Just red, filling every screen on every deck of every vessel in the line, and then nothing. I was aboard that flagship. I was the attester of the second watch, which means it was my sworn function to witness events and file them into the permanent record so that they became, by Vosk law, true. And I want you to understand something about my people before I tell you the rest of this, because without it none of what follows will make sense. To the Vosk, a signal is not a message about reality. A signal is reality. A banner raised is a fact sworn. We do not have a concept for a flag that lies, the way you do not have a concept for a number that is secretly a color. When the crimson square appeared on our screens, my entire body understood it as a legal event before my mind understood it as a threat. Marshal Overseer Drath, who commanded that battle line, saw the same 9 seconds of red that I did. Drath commanded 400 warships, drawn from 3 empires that agreed on almost nothing except their hatred of the human called Mara Halloran. Drath had spent the better part of 2 cycles hunting her, and when the Crimson Banner appeared, Drath, who I had watched order the destruction of a fueling depot without rising from the command seat, gave the order to hold position, not advance. Not fire, hold. 400 warships stopped in the dark of the Tannhäuser Reach by a square of color and the name attached to it. I tried to file it. That was my function. I opened the record and searched for the correct category, and there was none. There was no compact form for a fleet that surrenders its momentum to a banner. I want to be precise about this because the imprecision is the entire point. I sat at my station for the length of that watch, trying to attest to something my civilization had no language to attest to, and I failed, and the failure is the first true thing I ever recorded about Mara Halloran. The galaxy had a name for her by then. Most of you, hearing this account, already feel something at the name, some inherited dread you cannot quite source. By the time the Compact built its great fleet to destroy her, she had emptied more shipping lanes than any war in the recorded history of the Reach. She had taken convoys without firing. She had broken the morale of 3 empires with a piece of cloth. She had become the most feared signal in known space. And here is the thing I need to correct before I go any further, because every account you have heard of her is wrong in the same direction, and the wrongness is not an accident. It was manufactured, and I helped manufacture it, and this record is my attempt to file the correction. In every Raider legend in the Vosk archive, and we keep a very long archive, the figure at the center wanted what they became. The warlord wants the war. The Raider wants the spoil. The tyrant reaches for the throne and closes their grip. That is the shape of the story, across every species that has ever produced one, and it is a comfortable shape because it lets the listener believe that monstrousness is a thing a creature chooses, and therefore a thing that could never happen to you. Mara Halloran does not fit that shape. Mara Halloran never wanted command. She never wanted the banner. She never wanted a single ship that came to fear her, and she did not, at any point in the events I am about to attest to, want to be feared at all. What happened to her happened against her stated will, again and again, and what she did inside that unwanted life is the most remarkable thing I have ever failed to file correctly. So let me file it now. Let me start where it actually started, which is not with a fleet and not with a banner, but with a careful woman and a bad crossing. The Tannhäuser Reach in those cycles was a highway. I use your word because it fits. It was a dense and ungoverned cluster of dead transit gates and derelict relay stations strung between the borders of 3 empires, and it was lawless in the specific way that profitable places become lawless, not because no one wanted to govern it, but because everyone wanted to use it and no one wanted to pay for it. Convoys had to cross it. There was no route around. The debris of 1,000 abandoned constructions drifted through it, gates that no longer led anywhere, stations gone dark, the slow tumbling wreckage of every empire that had tried the reach and given up. Ships moved through it the way you move through a bad neighborhood at speed, lights low, weapons warm, hopping to be unremarkable. They were armed, most of them, but they were not warships. They were businesses. They were freighters and haulers and tankers crewed by beings who wanted only to reach the far side and be paid. One of them was a Hellion convoy tender called the Margin, and aboard the Margin, in the position of senior navigator, was a human named Mara Halloran. She was, by every account I have been able to gather and verify, entirely ordinary. She was perhaps in the middle of a human lifespan, experienced, literate in 4 root languages, and known among the Hellion crew as calm to the point of seeming slow, though it was not slowness. It was the particular stillness of a person who has decided in advance not to panic. She had no criminal record. She had no history of violence. She had a reputation, among the few who knew her, for plotting the safest possible course through the Reach and then holding to it exactly, which is the least romantic skill a being can have and the one that keeps the most people alive. She was a working navigator. That is all she was. I have read the manifest of the Margin and her name is on it under non-essential technical crew, and I find a great deal of bitter instruction in that phrase. And then a raider crew took the Margin. The crew belonged to a Sorth captain. The Sorth are a reptilian people, cold-blooded in the literal sense and famously close to it in the other, named in our records only as Vex, which was almost certainly not a name but a kill tally notation that the rest of his crew used because they were too frightened to use anything else. Vex's crew was a scrap fleet of 3 vessels that preyed on exactly the kind of convoy the Margin was, too valuable to ignore, too small to fight back. They came out of the wreckage field where they had been waiting, the way a thing waits in still water, and they took the Margin in under an hour, and they began the work that crews like Vex's always begin, which is the sorting of cargo and the sorting of people, the second being grimmer than the first. Vex's crew were sorting the Margin's people into those worth keeping, and those worth nothing when one of them noticed Halloran's navigation logs. The Reach is a maze, and a navigator who can cross it without dying is worth more than the cargo. Whether Vex selected her because of the logs, or because she was the only one in the holding bay who had not begun to scream, my sources disagree. What they do not disagree on is what happened to her next. She was taken aboard Vex's lead ship against her will, separated from the Margin's crew, and informed that she now plotted courses for the Sorth or she did not continue to exist. She plotted courses. She was, I remind you, a person who had decided in advance not to panic, and a person like that can do terrible mathematics very calmly. She kept the books of a raider she despised, and she kept them well, and she waited, the way she had waited out 1,000 bad crossings, for the situation to change. It changed in 6 weeks. The mathematics of raiding is unforgiving, and Vex was greedy past the point of arithmetic. He attempted to take a Dreven or hauler that turned out to be a disguised escort, and in the ambush that followed Vex was killed, opened from sternum to throat by a slug round in the first exchange, dead before his own crew understood the trap had closed. And here the situation did the thing that situations do when a cruel leader is suddenly removed. It did not resolve. It panicked. The scrap fleet was leaderless, bleeding atmosphere from 2 hulls, deep in hostile territory with an escort still firing, and the surviving crew, Sorth and Hellion conscripts, and a handful of other species pressed into service exactly as Halloran had been, had to decide who would give the orders that kept them alive, and they had to decide it in minutes. They voted. I find this detail almost unbearable in its strangeness, and I have filed it 3 separate times to be certain of it. A scrap crew of raiders in the middle of a firefight took a vote, and they did not vote for the cruelest among them, or the strongest, or the most Sorth. They voted for the calm human who had kept their courses clean for 6 weeks and never once raised her voice. They voted for the navigator. She had been among them less than 2 months, and she was not even of a warlike species by their reckoning, and they chose her anyway. Because in the moment that the panic took them, the only still thing in the room was Mara Halloran, and a frightened crew will follow stillness the way a freezing creature crawls toward warmth. She accepted. I have her words for this, recorded by a Hellion conscript who survived to testify and who swore he transcribed them exactly, and I believe him because the words are too plain to have been improved. When they told her she was now the captain, Halloran is reported to have looked at the firefight on the screens and said, "Fine, but we're not going to do it their way." That was all. Not a speech. Not a flag planted in the future. A correction of method. We're not going to do it their way. And then she plotted a course out of the ambush that should not have been possible, threading the scrap fleet through the wreckage field at a speed that left the Dreven escort firing into empty debris. And she got every surviving soul on those ships out alive, including the conscripts who had every reason to expect they would be abandoned the moment they stopped being useful. Her first act as captain was not what raider captains do. It was the opposite, and the opposite is where the whole legend begins, and the whole misunderstanding with it. Within days, the patched-together fleet fell upon a transport, a fat, slow, compact courier, exactly the kind of prize Vex would have gutted. The crew expected the gutting. The transport's crew expected it too. They had locked themselves in their core compartment to die with dignity, and Halloran did not board to kill. She hailed them, calm as a navigator reading a heading, and told them she was taking the cargo and the fuel and nothing else, and that they were free to go, and that to signal the all clear, to tell her own gun crews to stand down, and to tell the transport it could run, she would raise a marker on her hull. There was no time to manufacture anything proper. Someone found a length of crimson thermal cloth, the kind used to wrap cold damaged components, and they hung it across the forward sensor housing where every ship in scanning range would read it. Crimson, because it was what they had. The first crimson banner in the history of the Reach was a piece of insulation, and it meant, in the mind of the woman who raised it, "You may live. Go." The transport went. Its crew, every one of them alive, scattered to the relay stations on the far side of the Reach, and they did what survivors do. They told the story. And the story they told was true in every fact and wrong in every meaning, and that gap is the engine of everything that followed. Because consider how it sounded. A raider fleet falls on a compact courier. The crew locks itself away to die. A red banner is raised on the attacker's hull, and the crew survives, untouched, released. Now, a being who survived a thing they were certain would kill them does not come away calm. They come away marked. And when they describe the banner that flew over the worst hour of their life, they do not describe a length of thermal insulation hung in haste by a navigator who did not want to murder anyone. They describe a death standard. They describe the red flag of a raider who let them go this time, and the imagination supplies the rest, the way imagination always rushes to fill the space where mercy should be, because mercy from a raider is incomprehensible, and so the mind replaces it with a threat it can understand. The crimson banner, the survivors said, means she has chosen not to kill you yet. And other survivors, hearing this and being themselves released under the same red cloth, confirmed it, because they too had survived a thing that should have killed them, and they too needed a name for the dread that survival left in them. Within half a cycle, across 3 empires, every spacer in the Reach knew that the crimson banner was a death mark. It meant no survivors. It meant the human had decided your fate. And not one of them knew that the human, on every single occasion, had decided to let them live. I want to be honest in this record about my own part, because an attester who hides their own error has attested to nothing. The compact did not correct the misunderstanding. The compact amplified it. I was assigned in those cycles to the propaganda division of the Admiralty, and we read the survivor reports, and we understood very quickly that a terrifying enemy is a useful thing, a justification for budgets, for fleets, for the cooperation of empires that would not otherwise sit at the same table. We took the misread banner and we made it official. We circulated the death mark interpretation under attestation, which to a Vosk audience is the same as making it law. We turned a navigator's gesture of mercy into the most feared signal in known space, and we did it deliberately, and I signed the attestations myself. That is filed now. That is part of the record. What Halloran did with the reputation she had not asked for is the part I still cannot fully classify. She leaned into it. Not the cruelty, she never once supplied the cruelty the legend demanded, but the fear itself, the bare fact of it, she used like a tool. She discovered, as the cycles turned, that she no longer had to fight. She would approach a convoy, raise the crimson banner that the entire Reach now believed meant annihilation, and the convoy would surrender before a shot was fired. Crews abandoned ships at the sight of the Red Square. Captains transmitted their cargo manifests unbidden, begging to be allowed the all-clear. A relay station, Station Corvath, a fortified compact installation with defensive batteries that could have reduced her fleet to vapor, surrendered its entire docked convoy to a single ship flying a banner and a calm human voice on the open channel saying, in 4 root languages, that everyone aboard would live if they simply stood down. They stood down. The batteries never fired. Corvath was the moment the Admiralty stopped treating Halloran as a raider and started treating her as a weather system. And here is the part the survivors never reported, because they could not perceive it. Every one of those bloodless captures was bloodless by design. Halloran was not sparing them out of strategy. She was building the fear precisely so that she would never have to use the violence the fear implied. She had constructed, without anyone understanding it, a reputation so total that it made her gentle. The more terrifying the Crimson Banner became, the fewer beings she had to harm, until she was taking the richest convoys in the Reach without so much as charging a weapon, her gun crews growing rusty, her medical bay empty of prisoners because there were no prisoners, only people who had been allowed to go home. I tried, during this period, to file a report on her tactics for the Admiralty. I could not complete it. There was no compact form for a raider whose primary weapon was the enemy's belief that she was worse than she was. I requested a new form be drafted. The request was denied on the grounds that no such category of being existed. I have kept the denial. It is, in its way, the most accurate document the Admiralty ever produced. It could not last, of course, because the compact does not tolerate a weather system inside its shipping lanes. And eventually, the 3 empires did the thing that empires do when a single problem grows larger than their rivalry. They pooled their warships. They built the Great Fleet, 400 vessels under a unified command, and they gave that command to Marshal Overseer Drath, of the Hoken, a being for whom the existence of Mara Halloran had become something past tactics, something personal and itching, like a wound that has begun to think. Drath nearly took her once. I was there for it. We had laid a trap at a dead transit gate, a real one this time, with the bulk of the fleet hidden in the gate's sensor shadow, and Halloran's small fleet came through exactly as predicted, and Drath sprang it perfectly, and for the span of perhaps 4 minutes it worked. Her ships were boxed. Her escape vectors were closed. And then she did the thing that no model had predicted, because no model had been built for her. She did not fight, and she did not surrender. She raised the Crimson Banner at us, at 400 warships, and she opened the channel and she spoke calmly to the entire fleet, and she said that any vessel that wished to leave the Reach alive should simply break formation now. Because she had no quarrel with sailors, only with the beings who sent them to die for cargo. And then she ran a navigator's course through the dead gate that should have killed her and did not, and she was gone. And behind her, on our own screens, I watched 11 compact vessels break formation. Not destroyed, not boarded. They simply left because a calm voice under a red banner had offered them their lives, and they had taken the offer over their marshal's standing order. Drath had 400 ships, and had just learned that he could not be certain of any of them. Drath's response was to make it personal in the only language he had, which was contempt. He branded her across every relay in the Reach. He called her the Red Death, the Banner Witch, the thing that the dark of the Reach had birthed to feed on civilized crews. He attested, under the seal of the Admiralty, with my division's help to my lasting discredit, that she was not a being at all but an absence of being, a hunger wearing a human shape, and that the Crimson Banner was the last thing her victims ever saw. He made her into a demon formally, legally, in the Vosk sense, and he did it to shame her and to stiffen his own fleet. And Halton answered him, "This is the moment of everything I have witnessed that I understand the least and admire the most." She did not answer the demon branding with violence, which would have confirmed it. She did not answer it with denial, which no one would have believed. She answered it with paperwork. She broadcast on every open band in every root language the articles of her own fleet, the code by which her crew actually lived. And the code was this: every being aboard her ships of every species, conscript or volunteer, held a vote on every major decision and a full and equal share of every prize, with no being's share larger than another's, the captain included. Any crew that surrendered to her was to be released unharmed, without exception, and any of her own who harmed a surrendered crew would themselves be put off the ship. There was a schedule of compensation for the injured. There was a prohibition on cruelty so specific that it read like a confession of how cruel the rest of the Reach was. And at the bottom, the article that I have never managed to file under any heading, the one that broke the Admiralty's entire framing in a single line: "No banner of this fleet means death. The crimson is raised so that you may go. We have never once meant otherwise." Hath suppressed it. Of course he did. But you cannot suppress a thing transmitted on every open band, and the article spread the way the original misunderstanding had spread. And now the two versions of the Crimson Banner traveled the Reach together, the Death Mark and the Mercy Mark, and beings had to decide which to believe. And here is the cruelty of what the Compact had built, the cruelty I helped build. Most of them chose to keep believing the Death Mark, because mercy from the thing they had been taught to fear was more frightening than the fear had ever been. If the banner meant death, the universe was simple. If the banner meant mercy, if the most feared signal in known space had only ever been a careful woman telling frightened crews that they were allowed to live, then everything they had been told was a lie, and the demon was not a demon, and the empires that had branded her had branded their own better nature, and that was a thing most beings could not afford to know. They preferred the monster. The monster let them keep their world. I could not prefer the monster. I had read the article. I had by my function to file the truest available version of events, and the truest version was now sitting in front of me, and it was unbearable, and I sat with it for a long time before I understood what I was looking at, which was this. Mida Howe had emptied more shipping lanes than any war in the history of the Reach, had broken the morale of 3 empires, had made 400 warships hold their position with a square of cloth, and she had done all of it while barely discharging a weapon. The scale of her was enormous, and the violence of her was almost nothing. The warlords of our archive carved their reputations out of the dead. She had carved hers out of the living, out of every crew she let go to spread the story, and the story had done all her fighting for her. I checked the kill records. For the entire span of her command, cycles of it, dozens of captures, the terror of 3 empires, the confirmed deaths attributable to Mida Howe, Den's fleet numbered fewer than the dead from a single one of Death's disciplinary actions. The most feared being in known space had one of the lowest tallies of harm in the entire Reach. I filed that figure. I filed it twice. I still do not think anyone believed it, including on the bad watches me. The end came the way ends come to beings like her, which is to say it was small and stupid, and did not match the size of the life. Death finally cornered her fleet against a collapsed relay station, a real trap with no navigator's trick to undo it, the sensor shadows accounted for, the escape vectors mapped and closed by a being who had spent 2 cycles learning her. The engagement was brief. Her ships had teeth still, and she used them, because the article that forbade harming the surrendered said nothing about defending her own crew, and she defended them ferociously. But 400 warships are 400 warships. In the second exchange, a stray slug round not aimed, not a marksman's shot, Just the random violence of a battle line firing everything at once breached the command deck of her flagship and struck Maida Howe, then below the ribs. By the accounts of the crew who survived, she did not cry out. She gave one more course correction, a navigator to the last, threading the survivors of her fleet toward a gap in the formation that her death had in the chaos briefly opened. And then she was gone. She was, the survivors said, found upright at the navigation station, dead with her hand still on the heading, as though she had simply finished a crossing and was waiting to be paid. Her crew, under a standing order she had given long before, did not let her body fall into compact hands. They committed her to the dark of the reach between the dead gates, in the lawless space she had ruled with a piece of cloth and never owned a meter of. And then, this is the part I attest to with the most care, because it is the part that mattered, they raised the crimson banner one last time, over the fleeing remnant of the fleet, and they broadcast the article again on every band as they scattered. The death of the woman did not suppress the truth. It released it. There was no longer a fleet to protect, no longer a reputation to maintain, nothing left to lose by being understood, and so the survivors spent their last coordinated act telling the whole reach what the banner had always meant. What followed was the largest piracy tribunal in the history of the compact. The remnants of Howe's fleet that were captured, and many were brought to the Admiralty courts, and the courts faced a problem they could not file. The crew's two-step, every species among them, and their testimony agreed. They had not been forced to stay. They had stayed because the share was equal and the code was kept, and no being aboard was treated as non-essential technical crew. Conscripts taken as Howe and herself had been taken, two-step, that they had been offered release at the first opportunity and had chosen to remain. The tribunal had assembled to condemn a demon slaves and found instead a great many witnesses who insisted, calmly, in the manner they had clearly learned from their captain, that they had been part of the only fair thing they had ever seen. Some were condemned anyway, because tribunals must produce condemnations. Some were released as forced crew. But the testimony entered the permanent record under attestation, and once a thing is attested among the Vosk it cannot be unmade, and so the truth of the Crimson Banner became, finally, law. The age of the raiders in the Tansa Reach collapsed within a cycle of her death, not because Howe had been its leader, she had led nothing but her own small fleet, but because she had been its meaning. With her gone and the great compact fleet already assembled and paid for, the empires turned that fleet on every scrap crew in the Reach, and the lawless highway was lawless no longer. The dead gates were cleared. The relay stations were garrisoned. The thing that had made the Reach was swept out, and the convoys crossed in safety. And within a generation the spacers who crossed it had no idea that the safe lanes they traveled had been opened by a fleet they had been taught to call a demon. The Crimson Banner itself, the original. The length of thermal insulation hung in haste over a sensor housing by a navigator who did not want to commit murder was lost. It was on her flagship, presumably, and her flagship was scrapped or sold or broken up after the tribunal, and no one recorded what became of a piece of cold damaged component trapping. It was a tool. When the tool was no longer needed, it vanished the way tools do. But the meaning of it did not vanish, because meaning, once attested, does not break up for salvage. I am old now for a Vosk, and I have spent the long watches of my late cycles doing the thing I was always supposed to do, which is filing the record correctly. I have corrected the propaganda I signed. I have entered the article into the permanent archive under my own attestation. And I have, after a great deal of difficulty, created the new form, the one the Admiralty denied existed, and filed Mara Halloran under it. It is a category of one. It is the only entry it has ever held or, I suspect, will ever hold. A being who became the most feared signal in known space, and whose terrible signal, every single time it was raised, meant only that you were allowed to live. I have thought a great deal about what to make of her, in the way that an attester is not supposed to and cannot help, and what I have come to is this. A reputation is not a thing a being builds for themselves. It is a thing that other beings build for you, out of their own fear, in the shape that their fear can hold. And Mara Halloran's great and accidental genius was to understand that, and to let the galaxy build her into a monster, and then to refuse, quietly and completely and at the cost of her own life, to actually be one. She let them paint the demon, and she lived inside the painting as a navigator who let frightened crews go home, and the gap between the two was the only territory she ever truly held. The compact taught 3 empires to fear a square of red cloth. It never occurred to any of us, until she made us file it, that the most frightening thing a feared being can do is be kind. That mercy, to those who cannot comprehend it, is more terrifying than any cruelty, because cruelty confirms the world and mercy unmakes it. She crossed the reach a non-essential navigator on a stolen list, and she crossed it again as the thing that emptied its lanes with a flag, and she did the second exactly as carefully as the first, plotting the safest possible course through a lawless dark, and holding to it exactly so that everyone she could save would live. That was always the whole of her. Mara Halloran was a being who had every reason to become what she was named, and who chose instead, with a stillness I have never seen before or since, to be the opposite of it in the most dangerous space available to her. The Reach forgot the woman. It remembered the banner. And the banner, in the end, in the permanent and unbreakable record of my people, means exactly what she always swore it meant. It means you may go. It means live. There was never any other meaning. There was only a galaxy that could not bear to read it and one attester, far too late, who finally did.